This video is brought to you by Raycon and their all-new everyday earbuds. It's the biggest refresh of Raycons in years, adding new features like active noise cancelling and multi-device connect, all while remaining at Raycon's famously reasonable price. Click the link below to get 20 to 50% off your order plus free shipping, or stick around to the end of the video to learn more.
Right, so we've covered Guild Wars 2, we've covered World of Warcraft, but there's another MMO worth talking about this release season, and that is Throne and Liberty. Man, do I have thoughts about this game. To give some context, I went into this with astronomically low expectations. I mean, this is an MMO that began its life as a mobile game to the point that early betas still contained an autoplay feature when it was ported over to PC. It's also developed by NCSoft, who are known for their kind of pay-to-win heavy MMOs like Lineage and Aeon, and it's published by Amazon, who also don't have the best track record. Put simply, I fully expected this to be a complete dumpster fire at launch, particularly after just coming off the back of two of the most popular MMOs with their recent expansions, both of which I thoroughly enjoyed. To my utter surprise, somehow, against all odds, Throne and Liberty is not a complete disaster. This is, overall, a competent MMORPG, but only just barely, as there are caveats attached to just about every single one of its components. For example, the leveling experience is actually a pretty good time on account of some varied quest design, hidden puzzles, and a super populated world, the likes of which most MMOs don't really achieve these days, but the narrative that pulls you through it is about as dry as you might expect. The combat is flashy and mechanically engaging, but still has a number of pain points that can make it feel cumbersome. The Buildcraft is remarkably deep, but also feels rather bloated and difficult to experiment with on account of the upgrade system. The endgame content is fun to play, but it's completely hamstrung by the nonsensical way in which itemization is handled, and those pay-to-win elements aren't as egregious as I expected, but monetization on the whole is seriously taking the piss. But, there's a lot of buts to this one. So everyone's experience with it is going to vary wildly, depending on what you can and can't tolerate. I can honestly say I've had a fun time with the 40 or so hours I've played of Throne and Liberty, and for a free-to-play game, that's unarguably a good value proposition. So on that basis, I would recommend checking this out. But as the next big MMO to commit yourself to, I'm not so sure. Throne and Liberty begins where all MMOs do, character creation. Like seemingly all Korean-made MMOs, this one delivers on that front, all the sliders, colors, body art, and hairstyles to finesse to your liking. You're then launched into the story, and as far as that goes, look, I won't harp on about it too long, because unsurprisingly, it is the least interesting part about this whole package. To put it in Lord of the Rings terms, imagine Sauron looking for the One Ring, except the One Ring shattered, and its essence now lives on within a subset of humans, you included. Sauron is now kidnapping said humans to sap that essence from them, with the hopes that one day he'll reclaim the full power of the One Ring. To be frank, that broader plot is almost exactly what I expected. It's poorly written, with voice performances ranging from decent to awful, overflowing with technobabble and new character names flying at you every 2 minutes, and all leading up to an anticlimactic ending to set up future content. What I will give Throne and Liberty points for is the story presentation. This isn't your typical text blocks or canned animations. You actually got fully animated cutscenes on the regular, including your character, often the kind you'd only see in single-player RPGs. I also liked that whether or not you skip the cutscenes, you've got this narrator who summarizes what's happened, which did a good job at keeping me in the loop and also made this feel like a D&D adventure, particularly with how suspiciously similar she sounds to the Baldur's Gate 3 DM.
The Thonos orcs were trying to gain more strength to fight the Arkidu orcs by staging a festival of fire.
Thing is, the Golden Path actually barely connects to this main plot, outside of introducing you to the key characters that haphazardly come together at the end. While that results in the story being hilariously devoid of any build-up, the various side tangents that make up the bulk of the campaign did actually manage to pique my interest at times. One chapter, for example, had me dealing with a deranged doctor who I found out was drugging patients and taking them to his cellar, because it turns out he's a vampire. I was then sent to to some far-off tomb where I'd reawakened the spirit of a long-dead vampire slayer, and upon proving myself worthy through a set of trials, was able to transform into him on command. Not just for this quest, by the way, but as a permanent new combat ability. There was a chapter dealing with a dwarf bard who forgot how to summon golems or something, and I needed to find a way to jog his memory. There was another one where I hatched a plan to blow up a Dune-style sandworm. What does any of this have to do with the main plot? Like I said, absolutely nothing. But I appreciated the variety that came from straying away from that self-serious A-plot. That same variety is also present in the overall open world experience. Quests aren't always the expected fetch and collect. I liked that sometimes I needed to think a little critically. There was one where I had to grab some poisoned flowers, and among a crowd of players killing these living plant enemies in the hopes that they drop the flower, I realized that they were actually firing out poisonous projectiles that needed to land on the nearby flowers to turn them into the quest item. There was another time I needed to get a golem heart from an auction, but I could only go off the description of each auction item, so needed to listen carefully to make sure I bid for the right item.
I've never seen anything like this before. It's definitely a must-have for any golem enthusiast.
Between story quests, side quests, platforming challenges, hidden portals that would send me to memory puzzles or riddles, events where players are competing for the most kills, world bosses, credit where credit is due, the activities that you come across in the open world are surprisingly diverse and engaging, even if parts of it are a little rough around the edges, like traversal, for example, which doesn't feel great. A key reason I enjoyed the leveling experience so much was because of how immersed I felt in this world, and that's something I personally really value, but rarely get from modern MMORPGs. In fact, the only one in recent memory that did this for me was New World. Part of how Throne and Liberty achieves this is in the visuals. This is built in Unreal Engine 4, an engine that's very good at making beautiful, natural landscapes with nice lighting. As such, the game does look quite good by MMO standards. The art direction is admittedly a little uninspired with its familiar European castles and demonic ruins, but I didn't mind that understated look. You might have noticed as well that mounts aren't really a thing in the traditional sense. Instead, you unlock morphs that let you instantly shapeshift into animals for travel, which I think is a neat twist on the usual formula. Far more impressive though is the technical side. When you're soaring down from a mountaintop, it's easy to appreciate that wild draw distance, allowing you to see just how far you've come. Then there's the player density. Right away, you'll notice that the world is just packed with players, not just in major cities, but also in every minor town or open world event. And that does a lot to make this world feel alive. The game is also somehow able to manage this many players on screen without dragging down performance, outside of the world bosses where you've got literally hundreds of spell effects firing off from all directions. Granted, I'm playing on a very high-end rig, but I've heard similar reports from those on mid-range hardware, which is cool to see. It's likely one of the few benefits of this game starting out as a mobile title. That optimization is also very keenly felt in how seamlessly you move between spaces. You'll enter buildings for story missions and the game will just load you into a solo instance without any loading screen. Sometimes this is even used to rather cleverly mask a transition into a solo instance of the open world if the story demands it. Then there's fast travel, which, I mean, here's what that looks like. As you can see, basically instantaneous, and that's the same for entering dungeons, PvP, anything really. So yeah, I mean, all of that is undeniably impressive, and something that very few other MMORPGs offer, if any. Immersion alone isn't enough to carry an MMO for me though. What I'm also after is a solid combat model and the progression to support it. So, does Throne and Liberty have that? Well, it's a mixed bag. So there's a lot of moving parts to combat. It starts with your weapon selection, because yeah, there's no classes in this game, at least in the traditional sense. You kind of build your own class based on the two weapons you equip. There's a greatsword, longbow, daggers, staff, and more, all the typical fantasy weaponry, each with their own extensive suite of abilities that you can slot into your action bar, something I'll loop back to in a second. Notably, while you can swap the weapon in your main hand, that only changes your auto attack, as the abilities slotted into your action bar can be used regardless regardless of what's in your main hand. This was kind of weird to get used to at first. Typically, these kinds of MMOs will have you switching between weapon sets to access their abilities, and it'll kind of flip over your hotbar. And this breaks combat into manageable chunks, as you're only thinking about a limited number of abilities at any time. Even MMOs with traditional action bars will only have you cycling between like half a dozen abilities these days, with the rest of your abilities reserved for utility or burst windows. Playing Throne and Liberty as a DPS, man, maybe it's just the build I was playing, but having to keep track of like 12 or so abilities, most of which with pretty short cooldowns, with no global cooldown in between, it's a real challenge to say the least. Not saying it's a bad challenge, in fact that path to mastery is what kept combat so exciting, but I definitely found myself having to look at my action bar far more often than other MMOs, as muscle memory can only get you so far when you've got this much going on. The other aspect I struggled with a bit was responsiveness. Most of my abilities would fire out instantly and were easy enough to combo with others, but any with movement attached to them would kind of cause me to stop in place for a split second, which would sort of contradict the use of such an ability and causes combat overall to feel a little more clunky than it needs to be. That's especially true for melee. There's a reason I ended up picking 2 ranged weapons, because the melee abilities very often have some sort of animation lock associated with them, making them feel far less pleasant to use. Enemy telegraphs are also just not great, and having to keep an eye out for those underneath the visual clutter while being frequently stopped in place, it just didn't sound like a good time to me. You might think that I hate the combat then, but it does have its redeeming qualities. Abilities are flashy, but not overly so. It feels awesome to string together like 7 skills within a second, even if the animations don't blend very nicely. There's a parry system at play where a perfectly timed button press will completely nullify huge incoming damage and activate an ability depending on what weapon you parry with. Similarly, using crowd control abilities to knock enemies off cliffs or timing them to interrupt big enemy attacks is also quite satisfying. Honestly, I was impressed that NCSoft have managed to cobble together an actual, somewhat functioning combat system in a game that had autoplay just a year ago, and I did find myself thoroughly enjoying it by the time I hit the endgame. I found that the general difficulty of enemies really nicely complements the combat as well. They're not pushovers. In fact, I found myself on multiple occasions dying to small groups in the open world if I wasn't careful. Dungeons in particular are proper challenging, even at a baseline level. You're not able to steamroll through these, as even trash mobs have very hard-hitting abilities, and the final bosses often have mechanics that would typically be reserved for a raid or something. There's a sort of boss gauntlet tower climb that you can do solo that's equally challenging too, allowing you to test your personal skill and measure the impact of your upgrades. All of this demands the use of all of your tools: the parry, the grapple hook, your animal morphs, potions, and not just at the end game, but all throughout the leveling experience. It's all just enough to push combat over the line for me. The longevity of the combat system lies in the Buildcraft, which is quite extensive. At max level, you'll have over 24 active abilities between your 2 weapons that you'll mix and match, with an equal number of passive abilities that you've also got to slot in. The cool part is that each active ability has their own modification tree to change how they operate. For example, I can make this flurry attack fire in a straight line, a cone, or an AoE around me. I can also make abilities grant specific buffs or debuffs that might enable new synergies between abilities. This stuff is also, thankfully, free to respec, and as such, I found the Buildcraft endlessly fun to tinker with. However, the same cannot be said if you want to experiment with other weapon types. If you want to try out a different weapon for any reason, you're going to run into some problems. First of all, if you equip another weapon, the abilities on your action bar will not switch out. You need to manually drag your new active and passive abilities onto your bar every time. Then there's the fact that those modification points that you used on those previous weapons don't get automatically redeemed. You'll need to manually go to that screen, refund the points from the weapon abilities you no longer have access to, and then spend them elsewhere. By far, the biggest pain point though is the upgrade system. How this works is that all your weapons, accessories, armor, and skills can be leveled up through these specific upgrade books with varying ranks. The amount of XP they grant ranges between 25 and 80%, completely up to chance, as denoted at the bottom. The problem is that while these upgrade books are handed out like candy during the story, once you've finished that, you'll find that this falls off a cliff. Once you've used up all your big one-time sources, they become a very scarce resource, particularly the higher rank ones that are needed to max out your gear and abilities. There are items that can transfer those levels, and a bunch of them are being handed out for free at the moment, but of course, once that grace period ends, you'll be reliant on MTX, which we'll come back to. So this makes experimenting with different weapon combinations, or even abilities for the weapons you do use, unnecessarily punishing. If you're not interested in competing at the high end, then maybe this isn't a problem for you, but yeah, I still think it's troubling that you can completely screw yourself over if you haven't been following some sort of leveling guide from the jump. What's really, truly cooked, though, is the itemization in this game, and how it completely hamstrings the endgame loop, far more than it ought to. It's both poorly thought out and poorly communicated. I had to do a fair amount of digging to wrap my head around how gear acquisition works. So at the start of your journey, you're shown that crafting is a big part of gearing. And it's simple enough. You need a generic schematic of the same rarity as the item, a few materials, and boom, you've got your gear. You earn those schematics through daily contracts and side quests. Simple enough. But that's only how it works for the lowest tier, because once you go above that, you now need that item's specific schematic. The only way to get those is to actually loot the item first, then imprint it onto a schematic, which at that point, I guess is only useful for crafting copies of that item. Right, so then how do you go on to loot items directly? Well, you've got a number of methods. One is to get them as a drop from specific mobs, but they're extremely rare to the point that it's borderline impossible to get them that way. You can do weekly fetch quests in these open world dungeons, which is quite cool. These give you a random loot bag and a currency to buy gear, but it costs about 40 quests per item, which is over like a month of weeklies. Another option is to fill out this collection book thing, where you can deposit a set of gear to get a higher tier one. So for example, you can craft 4 green tier capes to get 1 blue tier cape. But since you can't really craft blue tier gear, if you want that purple tier cape, if I understand correctly, you'd need to craft heaps of those green tier capes to collect a full set of blue capes to then redeem for that 1 purple cape. And getting the materials for all of that is going to take a lot of dailies. Your final option is dungeon rewards, where the drop rates are clearly communicated in-game and every run provides tokens that let you save up for the item you want. I think this is the most alluring method for those familiar with MMOs. But this is, unfortunately, plagued by yet another set of problems. The way gear is distributed means that specific roles want to target specific dungeons. So if you're a healer, the best healer gear comes from certain dungeons. This presents a problem, because that means that the healers are not queuing up for the dungeons that the tanks or the DPS players need gear from, so queue times are just insane. Like, this game is at the peak of its popularity right now, and there are some dungeons I just haven't been able to do because I'd spend like an hour constantly re-queuing. Once you do finally get into a dungeon, the difficulty tuning is such that players tend to really struggle with the final boss, to the point that after just a couple wipes, people will start leaving, making the whole thing a complete waste of time. Now, like I said, I personally really like that challenge, but clearly not everyone does, and that's totally fair. So had there been difficulty tiers with lower drop rates but still rewarding those pity tokens, I think this method would be far more reliable. Speaking of those tokens, by the way, they are specific to each dungeon. So to buy just 1 piece of gear will cost you about 20 runs of the same dungeon. Alternatively, if you want to divvy things up a bit, there is purchasable gear that requires just 5 runs, but you've got to do that for all 6 dungeons per item. Given the problems with matchmaking, both of those are going to be a real pain in the ass unless you've got a group to run with. On top of that, even if you're lucky enough to consecutively get into dungeons, you can only open the final chest if you've got enough of a special resource that recharges over time. You get enough every 24 hours to do about 3 dungeons, and this does stack up enough that you aren't forced into spending it every day, but it does suck that this is something you need to be conscious of. To be clear, I don't actually mind how long all these methods take, given these are clearly meant to be very long-term goals for the highest tier of gear. But most of these methods get incredibly tedious if you're not up for that mindless grind, and unfortunately, the most enjoyable method, farming dungeons, has deeply rooted flaws. It's unlikely this will be fixed anytime soon, but this is an MMO after all, so only time will tell, I guess. All of this points toward a game encouraging you to spend real money to bypass these things, and I mean, even if the pay-to-win elements aren't as egregious as I expected, monetization on the whole is pretty ridiculous. So here in the conclusion, I just want to lay out how all that pay-to-win stuff works, exactly what you can and cannot buy. It's all driven by a premium currency that you can use in the in-game cash shop or in the trading post to purchase items from other players. So yes, this does mean that you can directly purchase the best gear if someone's put it up for sale, and that really blows, even if it is prohibitively expensive. Yes, that does technically mean that you can sell your drops for premium currency, but given those tradable items are incredibly rare, there is absolutely no way that the average player is going to earn enough to buy anything from the shop, especially given how pricey it all is. And I mean, yeah, let's take a look at the cash shop. So yeah, there are items here that let you recharge the dungeon resource, there are upgrade components, whatever, though these are all limited in quantity and can be easily bought out with a different currency earned from just playing the game. There's of course lots of cosmetics for sale here, with outfits costing literally 50 Australian dollars. That's not to say it's all locked behind the cash shop. Visual progression is a thing in this game, and I appreciated that there's plenty of cool looking gear to chase from just playing the game, but of course you can only transmog and dye paid outfits, which does suck. Then there's not one but two battle pass style things. One's a leveling pass that gives rewards for every level up to max level. The other is an actual battle pass with a shop of its own to split up the rewards, as if paying for the pass itself wasn't enough. Both have a free track that, let's face it, only exists to get you clicking on the menus to see what you're missing out on the premium track. And all those rewards are not just cosmetics either. They include materials, upgrade items. I mean, one reward is just a bunch of those dungeon pity tokens, cutting down the grind by a fair bit. So, is this pay to win? The simple answer is yes. The more nuanced answer is that it's more like pay to save time, because the upgrade ceiling isn't actually very high, so with perseverance, you'll eventually be at the same level as those who have paid money. It also depends on what you consider winning. For me, I just want to have a fair shake at all the content in the game and to be able to reasonably keep up. Does Throne and Liberty allow that? Not really. Given the true endgame revolves around guild PvP and guild raids that do require that high level of optimization, I do feel that those paying money are getting a leg up. And as more endgame content gets added to the game, as the power ceiling increases, the gap will only grow larger. Ultimately, if I was at a point in my life where I wanted to commit several hours every day to an MMO, Throne and Liberty wouldn't be super high on my list right now, but I can see why it might be a good fit for many. There are definitely parts of this game that will appeal to those who revel in the grind and the competition of old school MMOs, or those that are just happy to take that 40 to 50 hours of adventuring and jump off soon after reaching the endgame. The combat, progression, and immersion are enough to sustain that kind of playtime. If that sounds like you, then yeah, I think you should give Throne and Liberty a shot. It's free to play, you've really got nothing to lose but time. If you really value your time though, there are other great free-to-play, subscription-free MMOs more worthy of it. Games like Guild Wars 2, Warframe, or Path of Exile. And despite all those being over a decade old now, they'll probably take you less time to catch up on than Throne and Liberty. For that reason, I'm pretty mixed on this one, but if it clicks with you, I wish you the best in your adventures.
Listen, I know that you know what Raycons are. You've seen them all over the internet for years, including from myself. I've been partnered with Raycon for like 4 years now. Massive shout out to them, by the way, for the support they provided the channel. So you think you've seen Raycons 100 times before, but you haven't seen these Raycons, because for the first time in years, Raycon has done a full refresh of their flagship offering, their everyday earbuds. This new model is an evolution of Raycon's already incredibly solid and reliable product, improving every aspect of it while also adding entirely new features. On the improved side of things is the design, which is even more comfortable and ergonomic than before, and their in-ear design means that they stay on your ears way better than many other earbuds. There's also improved battery life. These things will go up to 32 hours now, 8 hours of direct playtime, and a fast charging case that gives you 90 minutes of playback in just 10 minutes of charging. In terms of newly added features, the everyday earbuds now have active noise cancelling, and this is a feature that you usually have to pay like a premium for from other brands, but Raycon have just added it while maintaining their same affordable price point that they've always been famous for. There's also now support for multi-point connectivity, meaning you can sync 2 devices at once, and the earbuds will automatically switch to whichever device is outputting audio. It is super convenient being able to sync these things to like an iPhone and an iPad at the same time. They even went the extra mile with the case, since in addition to your choice of colors for the earbuds, you can also buy a case protector that comes in a range of additional colors. I got the yellow sunset option, making it a lot easier to spot when I leave these things laying around my house, which is what I usually do. These everyday earbuds are brand new. They just arrived and they deliver so much value for money given how much functionality is baked into them given the price. I've used them for literally years now and have always been impressed with their performance and reliability. Hell, I actually own a few pairs of these because I like to keep one by my bedside that I just use at nighttime or whatever, and I keep one in my gym bag so that I don't accidentally forget to put them in my gym bag and then I have to go to the gym without earbuds, which really annoys me. If you want to grab a pair for yourself or for someone else, then you're in luck because Raycon are doing a special deal for viewers of this channel. Visit buyraycon.com/skillup for 20 to 50% off your order and free shipping. That link below is pinned in the top comment, but it's buyraycon.com/skillup for 20 to 50% off plus free shipping. Thanks Raycon for sponsoring the video and thank you for watching it.